Your great-grandmother mailed children through the post office. Your great-grandfather drank radioactive water for breakfast. And both of them probably watched a public execution as a fun weekend activity. These were not crimes. These were not mistakes. This was just life, exposed, raw, and deeply unhinged. Here are 33 things that were once completely, totally, boringly normal. And if you try any of them today, you will end up in prison, in the hospital, or on the news. 1. In the early 1900s, the United States Postal Service made a decision that, in hindsight, was absolutely bonkers. They started delivering humans, specifically children. See, when Parcel Post launched in 1913, the rules about what you could ship were hilariously vague. So naturally, some budget-conscious parents looked at train ticket prices, then looked at postage rates, did some quick math and thought, why not just mail the kid? One of the most famous cases involved a little girl from Ohio who was shipped to her grandmother for just 15 cents in stamps. She traveled in the mail car, watched over by a very confused postal worker. The USPS eventually caught on and explicitly banned human shipments in 1920. But for about 7 glorious years, if your package was crying and needed a diaper change, that was just part of the job. 2. Today, cocaine is a Schedule II controlled substance that will land you in prison faster than you can say, bad life choices. But rewind to the late 1800s, and this stuff was basically the aspirin of its era. Pharmacies sold it openly. Doctors prescribed it for everything. Got a toothache? Cocaine. Kid won't stop crying? Rub some cocaine on their gums. Feeling a little tired? Cocaine-infused wine will perk you right up. Even Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, was out here writing love letters to the drug, recommending it to friends, colleagues, and patients like he was running a multi-level marketing scheme. Coca-Cola famously contained coca leaf extract in its original recipe. It took decades of people becoming horrifically addicted before anyone said, hey, maybe we should regulate this. Revolutionary thinking, truly. 3. Divorce. In medieval Germany was not a simple matter of paperwork and splitting the furniture. If a married couple had an irreconcilable dispute and one party demanded satisfaction, they could settle it the old-fashioned way, through legally sanctioned combat. But here is where it gets interesting. To make it fair, the man had to stand waist-deep in a hole dug into the ground with one arm tied behind his back. He got a wooden club. The woman, standing at ground level, got a heavy rock wrapped in cloth or stuffed in a sack. And then they just went at it. If the man lost, he was executed. If the woman lost, she was buried alive. These fights were public spectacles with official rules, referees, and cheering crowds. Relationship counseling really has come a long way since then. 4. Parenting. In the 1930s operated on a completely different wavelength than today. Case in point, baby cages. Yes, that is exactly what it sounds like. Wire mesh cages that parents would attach to the outside of their apartment windows, then place their infant inside so the baby could enjoy fresh air and sunlight, while suspended several stories above a busy London street. This was not considered child endangerment. This was considered progressive parenting, endorsed by childcare experts who believed fresh air was essential for healthy development. The cages were patented, manufactured, and sold to families who apparently looked at their newborn and thought, you know what this baby needs? To dangle over traffic like a window-mounted air conditioning unit. Shockingly, these never really caught on in America. Even we had limits. 5. When Marie Curie discovered radium in 1898, humanity responded the way it always does to new discoveries, by putting it in absolutely everything without asking questions. Radium toothpaste, radium suppositories, radium-infused chocolate, and most famously, Radithor, a radioactive energy drink marketed as liquid sunshine that would cure everything from impotence to mental illness. Wealthy industrialist Eben Byers became the poster child for why this was a terrible idea. He loved Radithor so much he drank nearly 1,400 bottles over 3 years. Then his jaw literally fell off. His skull developed holes. He died in 1932 from radiation poisoning so severe that when they exhumed his body decades later, it was still radioactive. The Wall Street Journal ran perhaps the greatest headline in journalistic history. The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. 6. Before alarm clocks became affordable and reliable, the working class of industrial Britain faced a genuine problem. How do you wake up for your 6 a.m. factory shift when you cannot afford a clock? Enter the knocker-upper. This was an actual profession. Someone, usually an elderly person or someone who worked night shifts anyway, would walk through neighborhoods in the pre-dawn darkness armed with a long bamboo stick or a pea shooter. Their job was to tap on your bedroom window or shoot dried peas at the glass until you woke up and waved to confirm you were conscious. They would not leave until they saw movement. The truly wild part is that knocker-uppers existed well into the 1950s in some industrial towns. And of course, this raises the eternal question that apparently no one could answer. Who woke up the knocker-upper? 7. Divorce in 18th century England was technically possible, but it required an act of parliament, cost a fortune, and was basically only available to wealthy men. So the common folk developed a creative workaround: wife selling. The husband would put a halter or rope around his wife's neck, lead her to the local market or tavern, and auction her off to the highest bidder like livestock. This sounds horrific, and it kind of was, but here is the twist. These sales were often prearranged. The wife already had a buyer in mind, usually her lover, and the whole public spectacle was essentially a theatrical performance to legitimize what was basically a consensual divorce and remarriage. The community witnessed it, everyone pretended it was legal, and life moved on. The last recorded wife sale in England happened in 1913. That is disturbingly recent. 8. The relationship between doctors and cigarettes in the mid-20th century was less cautious medical skepticism and more passionate love affair. Physicians did not just smoke, they smoked while examining patients. They smoked in operating rooms. They appeared in advertisements actively endorsing specific cigarette brands, claiming they were gentle on the throat and good for digestion. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette was an actual marketing slogan backed by surveys where tobacco companies handed out free cartons to physicians before asking which brand they preferred. Pregnant women were told smoking would help with stress and keep their weight down. Hospitals had smoking lounges. Patients recovering from lung surgery could light up in their beds. It took until 1964 for the Surgeon General to officially announce that cigarettes cause cancer. And even then, people acted shocked. Truly a medical mystery no one saw coming. 9. Medieval Europe had a justice system that can only be described as comprehensively insane, and nothing proves this better than animal trials. If a pig killed a child, that pig was not just slaughtered. It was arrested, imprisoned, given a court-appointed lawyer, tried before a judge, and if found guilty, publicly executed, sometimes wearing human clothes. This happened constantly. In 1386, a pig in France was hanged for murdering an infant. In 1474, a rooster was burned at the stake for laying an egg, which was considered witchcraft. Rats, weevils, and locusts were summoned to court and excommunicated by the church for destroying crops. The animals rarely showed up to their hearings, which the courts interpreted as contempt. Defense lawyers argued their clients were acting on instinct. It almost never worked. Justice was served, medieval style. 10. Chemistry sets for children used to be genuinely dangerous, and that was considered a feature, not a bug. In the early 20th century, these kits included chemicals that would make a modern safety inspector faint on the spot. Sodium cyanide, potassium nitrate, sulfuric acid, and yes, sometimes the raw ingredients to make actual explosives. The Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Lab from 1950 came with real uranium ore samples and a Geiger counter so kids could measure the radiation they were being exposed to. The instructions encouraged young scientists to experiment freely, with minimal adult supervision, because that is how you learned. Remarkably, the concern was never safety. These sets were discontinued because they were too expensive to produce, and kids found them boring compared to other toys. Our ancestors really just built different, and by different, I mean reckless. 11. Lysol today is the stuff you spray on doorknobs and toilet seats to kill 99.9% of germs. It is industrial-strength disinfectant. But for nearly 4 decades in the early 20th century, Lysol was aggressively marketed to women as a gentle, safe product for intimate feminine hygiene. The advertisements were masterpieces of euphemism, promising to protect married happiness and prevent intimate neglect that might drive husbands away. What the ads did not mention was that Lysol at the time was significantly more caustic than modern formulations and caused chemical burns, infections, and in some cases, death. Medical journals documented over 200 Lysol poisonings by 1911, yet the marketing continued into the 1960s. It was also widely understood to be a coded advertisement for contraception, which could not be openly discussed. Women were literally poisoning themselves because society refused to talk about birth control. 12. Before forensic science existed, medieval courts had to get creative when determining guilt or innocence. Enter the coarsened or trial by blessed bread, sometimes called trial by cake. Here is how it worked. A priest would bless a piece of barley bread or cheese, the accused would be forced to eat it, and if they choked or could not swallow, God had clearly revealed their guilt. If the food went down smoothly, they were innocent. The logic was that divine intervention would cause a guilty person's throat to seize up. In reality, someone who was terrified, dehydrated, and stress-sweating through an accusation of crime would probably struggle to swallow dry bread, regardless of their actual innocence. One legend claims that Earl Godwin of Wessex died in 1053 after choking on blessed bread while denying involvement in a murder. Whether that proves divine justice or just poor eating habits remains unclear. 13. College students in every era find creative ways to be absolutely ridiculous, but the late 1930s might have produced peak absurdity with the goldfish swallowing craze. It started in 1939 when a Harvard freshman named Lothrop Withington Jr. swallowed a live goldfish on a bet, reportedly chasing it with a potato. The story hit newspapers, and suddenly campuses across America erupted in competitive fish consumption. Students tried to outdo each other, with the record climbing from 1 fish to over 300 in some disputed claims. Universities threatened expulsion. Animal welfare groups protested. The Massachusetts state legislature actually introduced a bill to protect goldfish from being swallowed. A senator called it an insult to the fish. The craze died out when World War II gave young men something more serious to focus on. But for one glorious year, ichthyophagy was the hottest trend in higher education. 14. The lobotomy might be the most disturbing medical treatment ever to win a Nobel Prize. Developed in the 1930s and popularized through the 50s, this procedure involved severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex to treat mental illness. Dr. Walter Freeman became its biggest evangelist, touring the country in a van he called the Lobotomobile, performing the operation on anyone deemed problematic. Rebellious teenagers, depressed housewives, people with headaches. His signature technique involved inserting an ice pick through the eye socket and wiggling it around. No anesthesia required, he claimed. He performed nearly 3,500 lobotomies, sometimes on children as young as 4. The results were predictable. Patients became docile, yes, but also vacant, incontinent, and frequently vegetative. Rosemary Kennedy, sister of President John F. Kennedy, was lobotomized at 23 and required care for the rest of her life. Freeman lost his license in 1967 after a patient died. That is how long it took. 15. Lawn darts, marketed under the cheerful brand name Jarts, were exactly what they sound like. Large, heavy metal spikes with plastic fins that you threw into the air, hoping they would land point down in a target ring on the ground while family members stood nearby. This was considered wholesome backyard entertainment throughout the 1960s and 70s. The darts weighed about half a kilogram each and fell with enough force to penetrate a human skull, which they did, multiple times. Between 1978 and 1988, lawn darts sent over 6,700 people to emergency rooms. 3 children died. The Consumer Product Safety Commission banned them in 1988 after years of lobbying and multiple failed voluntary restrictions. The ban specifically mentioned that the darts could cause skull penetrations. Some families still have vintage sets in their garages, waiting to traumatize a new generation of backyard barbecue attendees. 16. Water in the Middle Ages was genuinely trying to kill you. Rivers were open sewers. Wells were contaminated. Drinking unboiled water was basically gambling with your intestines. So everyone, from peasants to nobles, from elderly monks to literal toddlers, drank beer instead. Specifically, small beer, a low-alcohol brew around 1 to 2% that was safe because the brewing process killed pathogens. It was consumed at breakfast, lunch, dinner, and throughout the workday. Children drank it. Pregnant women drank it. Monks in monasteries sometimes consumed up to 5 liters daily. This was not considered alcoholism. This was basic hydration. The alcohol content was low enough that people were not constantly drunk, just slightly buzzed from sunrise to sunset. Clean drinking water is honestly one of humanity's most underrated achievements. We went from toddlers need beer to survive to tap water in about 400 years. 17. When photography emerged in the mid-19th century, it was expensive, time-consuming, and rare. Most people might only be photographed a handful of times in their entire lives. So when a loved one died, Victorian families saw an opportunity. One final portrait. Postmortem photography became a massive industry. Professional photographers would arrive at homes, prop up the recently deceased using metal stands and positioning brackets, and arrange them to look as lifelike as possible. Sometimes the dead were posed sitting in chairs, holding books, or surrounded by living family members. Eyes were sometimes painted onto closed eyelids in the finished photograph. Children were especially common subjects, given high infant mortality rates. These images were treasured keepsakes, displayed prominently in homes and sent to relatives. To us, it seems macabre. To them, it was a precious final memory of someone they loved, captured using the miraculous new technology of the age. 18. Commercial air travel in the mid-20th century was essentially a flying cocktail lounge where cigarettes were mandatory. Smoking on airplanes was not just permitted, it was expected. Passengers lit up before takeoff, during meals, and throughout the flight. Flight attendants handed out complimentary cigarettes. Ashtrays were built into every armrest. The cabin air was thick enough to obscure the person sitting next to you. Non-smoking sections existed, but they were a joke since everyone was breathing the same recirculated air anyway. Being seated in non-smoking just meant you were 3 rows away from someone blowing smoke directly into your face. Airlines did not start restricting smoking until the late 1980s, and full bans were not universal until 2000. That is right. People were hotboxing commercial aircraft within many of our lifetimes. The modern panic over someone vaping in an airplane bathroom is adorable by comparison. 19. Being wealthy in 18th century England meant having land, and having land meant having elaborate gardens. But a truly distinguished estate needed something special: a hermit. Ornamental hermits were real human beings hired to live on the property, usually in a rustic grotto or fake cave, wearing ragged robes, never cutting their hair or nails, and generally looking as wild and disheveled as possible. Their job was to provide atmosphere. Dinner guests would stroll through the gardens and encounter this picturesque figure of solitude and contemplation, adding philosophical ambiance to the evening. Contracts typically ran 7 years and required the hermit to remain on the property without speaking to anyone. Payment was substantial, but many hermits were fired for sneaking off to the pub or bathing when they were explicitly contracted to remain filthy. It was essentially paying someone to become a living garden gnome. Rich people have always been deeply weird. 20. The 1920s through 1950s brought us many innovations, and one of the most baffling was the shoe-fitting fluoroscope. This was a large wooden cabinet containing an X-ray tube at the bottom. You would stick your feet in, look through a viewing port at the top, and see a live X-ray image of your foot bones inside the shoe. Parents loved it because they could verify that little Jimmy's new shoes actually fit. Kids loved it because they could wiggle their skeleton toes. Shoe salesmen loved it because it made them seem scientific. The machines delivered radiation doses hundreds of times higher than a modern chest X-ray, and children often used them repeatedly for fun while waiting for parents to shop. Staff operating the machines received even higher exposures. They were not banned until the 1970s in some states. It turns out blasting children with radiation to sell footwear was not the medical breakthrough anyone hoped for. 21. Medieval England's tax system was remarkably flexible about what counted as currency, and in certain regions the answer was eels, lots and lots of eels. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, records numerous properties where rent was paid partially or entirely in eels, sometimes tens of thousands of them annually. Ely, a town in the Fenlands, literally means eel district, and owed the crown staggering quantities of the slippery fish each year. Eels were abundant in English rivers and marshes, relatively easy to catch, highly nutritious, and preserved well when smoked. They functioned as a legitimate medium of exchange. Landlords accepted them. The church accepted them. The crown accepted them. Somewhere, a medieval tax collector had to count bucket after bucket of wriggling eels and record the exact amounts in official ledgers. Bureaucracy has always been deeply unglamorous work, but eel counting represents a special kind of administrative suffering. 22. Early automobiles were designed with an almost artistic indifference to passenger survival. Dashboards were made of rigid metal, often featuring decorative chrome spikes and protrusions. Steering columns were solid steel rods pointed directly at the driver's chest. Windshields shattered into jagged shards on impact. And seat belts, despite existing since 1885, were considered unnecessary at best and insulting at worst. The logic was fascinating. Wearing a seatbelt implied you did not trust the driver's abilities, or worse, that you expected a crash. It was an admission of incompetence. When Ford introduced optional seatbelts in 1956, sales actually dropped because customers thought it meant the cars were unsafe. Mandatory seatbelt laws were not passed until the 1980s in most places and were met with furious protests about government overreach. People genuinely argued for their right to become human projectiles during collisions. Freedom is a complicated concept. 23. Renaissance. Venice was the fashion capital of Europe, and nothing demonstrated wealth quite like Chopin's. Platform shoes, so absurdly tall they essentially turned walking into an extreme sport. These shoes featured wooden or cork platforms that elevated the wearer anywhere from 15 to 50 centimeters off the ground, with some recorded examples reaching half a meter or more. Women wearing them literally could not walk unassisted. They needed servants on either side, supporting their arms to take each step without toppling over. The height was the point. It displayed that you were wealthy enough to own impractical footwear and employ people specifically to help you move around. Sumptuary laws eventually tried to limit Chopin height because women kept falling and injuring themselves. The shoes remained fashionable for over a century anyway. Humans have always been willing to risk injury for fashion. We just used to be more dramatic about it. 24. When medieval courts could not determine guilt through evidence or testimony, they outsourced the decision to God through trial by ordeal. The most common method involved the accused grasping a red-hot iron bar and walking 9 paces, or plunging their hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. The wound was then bandaged and examined after 3 days. If it was healing cleanly, God had declared innocence. If it was infected and festering, guilt was proven and punishment followed. The system was eventually abolished in 1215 when the church withdrew its participation, not because anyone realized it was insane, but because theological debates questioned whether forcing divine intervention was appropriate. Scholars today theorize that priests may have manipulated outcomes by heating the iron less for those they believed innocent. So even supposedly supernatural justice had corruption. Nothing is sacred, apparently, including trial by literal burning metal. 25. Modern elevators are marvels of automation. You press a button, the doors close, and you arrive at your floor with the car perfectly aligned. This was absolutely not how early elevators worked. Manual elevators required a human operator who controlled the speed and stopping position using a hand crank or lever. The skill required was substantial because the elevator would not automatically level with the floor. The operator had to eyeball it and stop at exactly the right moment. If they overshot or undershot, passengers faced a gap between the elevator floor and the building floor, sometimes several inches or more. Tripping was common. Falls were common. Getting limbs caught in closing gates while trying to step across gaps was horrifyingly common. Elevator operator was a skilled profession requiring training and certification. The transition to automatic elevators in the mid-20th century eliminated tens of thousands of jobs but probably saved countless ankles. 26. Victorian and Edwardian fashion had an obsession with birds that makes modern animal rights activists weep. We are not talking about feathers here. We are talking about entire taxidermied birds mounted on women's hats, complete with wings, heads, glass eyes, and sometimes arranged in nesting poses with fake eggs. Hummingbirds, owls, parrots, and egrets were especially popular. The millinery trade killed an estimated 5 million birds annually in the United States alone by 1900. Entire species were hunted to near extinction purely for hat decoration. The snowy egret almost disappeared completely. This fashion eventually sparked one of the earliest conservation movements when outraged women formed the Audubon Society and campaigned against murderous millinery. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 finally provided legal protection. So the next time someone mocks environmentalists, remember that we were once killing millions of birds annually so women could wear small corpses on their heads. 27. Public executions in medieval and early modern Europe were not somber affairs reflecting on justice and mortality. They were festivals. Major executions drew crowds in the thousands. Vendors sold food, drinks, and souvenirs. Families brought children. People rented rooms overlooking the scaffold at premium prices. The execution itself was entertainment, with the condemned often expected to give a speech, and the crowd evaluating their performance. Did they die bravely or cry? Good deaths were applauded. Pamphlets describing the criminal's life and final moments were published and sold immediately afterward. In England, you could buy pieces of the hanging rope as lucky charms. In France, executioners sold vials of blood. The carnival atmosphere was considered completely normal and even morally educational, supposedly demonstrating the consequences of sin. Public executions were not abolished in most of Europe until the mid-19th century. Turns out watching people die was family entertainment for most of human history. 28. Ancient Egyptian medicine was a fascinating mixture of remarkably advanced techniques and treatments that make you question everything. They performed successful surgeries, set broken bones expertly, and developed pharmaceutical compounds still studied today. They also believed that putting a live dung beetle in your ear would cure deafness and earaches. The scarab beetle was sacred in Egyptian religion, associated with the sun god Ra and the cycle of rebirth, so it made theological sense that these holy insects might have healing properties. Medical papyri contain numerous prescriptions involving beetle parts, beetle secretions, and yes, whole living beetles inserted into various body cavities. Other ear treatments included pouring goose fat mixed with garlic into the ear canal or applying a paste made from animal dung. Amazingly, their success rate for many conditions was surprisingly good, probably despite these treatments rather than because of them. 29. The treatment of asthma in the early 20th century followed logic that was internally consistent yet completely backwards. Doctors observed that bronchial tubes constricted during asthma attacks, making breathing difficult. They needed something to open those airways. Cigarettes were known to produce a warming sensation in the throat and lungs. Therefore, smoking should help. Pharmaceutical companies manufactured special medicated cigarettes containing stramonium, belladonna, and other herbs that were marketed specifically for respiratory conditions. Brands like Asthmador and Potter's asthma cigarettes were sold in pharmacies with doctor endorsements. patients were instructed to smoke them during attacks. The smoke did provide some temporary relief because certain compounds acted as bronchodilators, but the long-term damage to already compromised lungs was catastrophic. This practice continued into the 1970s. Doctors were literally prescribing the inhalation of burning plant matter to people who could not breathe. Medical history is wild. 30. Sitting upright in chairs to eat meals is actually a relatively modern convention. The ancient Greeks and Romans considered it far more civilized to dine while reclining on couches called clini or triclinia, lying on your stomach or side, propped up on your left elbow, using your right hand to eat. Formal dining rooms were designed around this arrangement, with 3 couches forming a U shape around a central table. Reclining indicated leisure, status, and freedom from manual labor. Sitting upright was for servants, children, and the lower classes who had to eat quickly and get back to work. The position also supposedly aided digestion, though modern doctors would strongly disagree. This tradition persisted for over 1,000 years across multiple civilizations. The transition to chairs happened gradually during the medieval period, so if you have ever wanted to eat dinner lying down like a Roman senator, just know that historically you would have been the sophisticated one. 31. Victorian beauty standards demanded impossibly tiny waists, and women pursued this ideal through methods that ranged from uncomfortable to genuinely horrifying. Among the most disturbing was the tapeworm diet. The concept was simple. Swallow a pill containing tapeworm eggs, let the parasites hatch and grow inside your intestines, and they would consume a portion of everything you ate, allowing weight loss without dietary restriction. Advertisements for these pills were real, promising easy slimming with no effort. The results were predictably nightmarish. Tapeworms can grow over 9 meters long inside the human body, cause severe malnutrition, organ damage, and in the case of certain species, form cysts in the brain. Some women died. The practice was eventually banned, but not before countless people deliberately infected themselves with parasites because society told them being thin was worth any price. Diet culture has always been unhinged. 32. Corporal punishment in schools was not some medieval relic that disappeared with the Enlightenment. It was standard educational practice across most of the world until shockingly recently, and remains legal in some places today. Teachers were authorized and often expected to physically discipline students using canes, rulers, wooden paddles, leather straps, and sometimes bare hands. Offenses warranting beatings ranged from talking in class to making mathematical errors to simply annoying the teacher. Students were struck on hands, backsides, and occasionally faces. In Britain, the cane was not banned in state schools until 1986. In parts of the United States, paddling remains legal in 19 states as of recent years. The phrase, "spare the rod, spoil the child," was taken literally for centuries. Generations of children were beaten by authority figures as a normal part of education, and many adults today can remember being hit by teachers. Progress is slower than we like to believe. 33. Indoor plumbing is so ubiquitous today that we forget humanity spent most of its existence without it. For millennia, the chamber pot was the standard toilet, a ceramic or metal bowl kept under the bed or in a cabinet, used throughout the night and emptied in the morning. Where did you empty it? Out the window into the street below, obviously. In cities, this created open sewers running down every road. Edinburgh was so notorious for this practice that residents would shout "Gardez l'eau," meaning "watch out for the water" in French, before dumping their waste. This phrase allegedly evolved into the British slang "loo" for toilet. Cesspools collected waste beneath buildings, periodically emptied by workers called night soilmen who carted human excrement out of cities. The smell of historical cities was unimaginable by modern standards. Every romantic period drama conveniently ignores that the streets were literally rivers of human sewage. History smelled terrible. Mailing kids, drinking radiation, beating students, dumping human waste out windows, all completely normal, all completely legal. Which makes you wonder, what are we doing right now that will make people in 2150 say, What the hell was wrong with them? I genuinely want to know your answer. Drop it in the comments because I am building a list, and some of your habits are definitely making it. Like this video if you are glad you were not born in the Middle Ages, and subscribe so you do not miss the next dose of historical insanity.